Welcome to the debate. Today, we are wading into one of the deepest intellectual trenches in modern thought. The friction between established evolutionary science and, well, the concepts proposed by intelligent design, or ID theory.
Right. And this isn't just a squabble over, biological details. This is fundamentally a debate about the limits of scientific methodology. Whether science, by its very nature, can and should be open to the possibility of non-natural causation when we're examining the origins of life and, indeed, the universe.
Indeed. The central question we face really is whether intelligent design presents a substantive, credible scientific challenge to the methodology and conclusions of modern science, or if it is primarily an ideological position, what some people call a philosophical strategy dressed up in scientific language.
And I'll be taking the position that ID is fundamentally a failed scientific endeavor. It's basically an old, scientifically deficient theological argument. You could call it an intellectual descendant of creationism focused on non-scientific, often political goals, and frankly, it offers nothing robust to the current scientific literature.
And I take the opposing view, that ID presents genuine scientific problems, like the extreme functional dependence found in biological systems, what's known as irreducible complexity, and also the precise fine-tuning of the cosmos. That really challenged the sufficiency of purely naturalistic explanations. We have to explore those challenges seriously. So intelligent design, I think, demands our attention because its challenge goes straight to the heart of how modern science is conducted. ID theorists argue that the assumption that all causation must be material and non-supernatural, a position known as philosophical naturalism, is an unnecessary and, well, a limiting constraint on scientific inquiry. They argue that if we remove this constraint, the evidence for design becomes palpable. The core of the ID argument rests on identifying complexity in nature that seems mathematically or conceptually impossible to attribute to random chance and natural law acting alone, thereby requiring an intelligent cause. This is primarily developed through two related concepts, specified complexity and irreducible complexity, or IC. And when we look at, say, the molecular machines inside our cells, IC suggests that certain systems are just non-functional if even one small part is removed. This seems to defy the gradual, step-by-step construction required by Darwinian evolution.
Well, I come at it from a rather different angle. I see ID as nothing more than the familiar arguments from design that have existed for centuries, honestly, now just repackaged with newer terminology like specified complexity. It's fundamentally an ideological vehicle, specifically crafted to advance a pre-existing socio-political agenda, the so-called wedge strategy, which aims to displace secular thinking in public life. Crucially, the scientific failure of ID lies in its misunderstanding, or perhaps intentional conflation, of methodological naturalism versus metaphysical naturalism. Science adheres to methodological naturalism. Now, this isn't an assertion that supernatural causes don't exist. That's the realm of metaphysical naturalism, a philosophical stance. Methodological naturalism is merely the operational rule of science. It demands that all explanations be empirically testable, subject to scrutiny, and stated in terms of natural mechanisms we can actually investigate. ID's fatal flaw, in my view, is that it refuses to propose a testable mechanism for the designer. If something is designed, science must ask, how did the design originate? By what physical or informational processes was it implemented? ID theorists simply leave the concept of the supernatural designer utterly opaque and beyond the hope of rational inquiry. That isn't a scientific theory, it's an intellectual cul-de-sac.
Okay, but let's zero in on the scientific claim itself. Irreducible complexity. Michael Behe's mousetrap analogy, I think, presents a very clear conceptual hurdle. How can a system that requires, say, all 5 components simultaneously to function actually evolve through small successive modifications, where each step has to confer some kind of selective advantage? If any precursor stage is missing a key component, it's non-functional. It offers zero advantage, meaning natural selection cannot select for it. This isn't just a minor challenge. It argues against the fundamental sufficiency of random variation and cumulative selection.
Right. I see why you rely on that analogy. It's often used. But let me offer a different perspective on biological reality. That analogy fails, I think, because organisms are not deliberately designed machines like watches or mousetraps. Biology is messy. It doesn't build things neatly from scratch. It constantly tinkers, you know? The complexity we actually observe is overwhelmingly accounted for by mechanisms like exaptation, where older structures, perhaps evolved for one purpose, are co-opted for a brand new one. So, for example, a bone originally used for jaw support might be exapted into the mammalian inner ear. And furthermore, gene duplication provides redundant copies of functional systems. This allows one copy to mutate and maybe acquire a novel function without destroying the original vital function.
But that still requires a massive probabilistic leap, doesn't it? To take several disparate, previously functioning components and somehow coordinate them into a new, single, tightly integrated system like the bacterial flagellum, which is often cited as an IC example, that seems to require an enormous dose of luck to co-opt all the necessary parts simultaneously and arrange them in the precise sequential order needed for functionality. The problem is coordination. Exaptation might explain how individual parts could exist, sure, but not how their interdependence is established without some kind of overarching plan or foresight.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it seems like you're modeling evolution as if it were solving an engineering problem in a strictly linear fashion. The IC argument kind of assumes that the current function is the only function the system has ever had. But complexity can arise through loss and rearrangement of parts, not just simple addition. I would argue that IC is perhaps better modeled as something like a freestanding arch built gradually using scaffolding. The scaffolding provides temporary support and function, allowing the stones, the components, to be placed and fixed. Once the arch is complete, the scaffolding is removed and the final structure is indeed irreducibly complex. It's dependent on all its parts. But its evolution was gradual and functional at every single stage. And moreover, the empirical evidence often defeats the IC premise anyway.
Molecular biology experiments sometimes reveal that removing a specific component doesn't actually stop the system entirely. Other genetic variants or components can step in to compensate. This illustrates a kind of redundancy that defeats the minimalist mousetrap concept. The systems are incredibly complex, yes, but not necessarily functionally irreducible in the absolute sense required by ID theory.
Okay, let's pivot then to a different argument ID proponents frequently leverage, one which operates at the highest level of physics: thermodynamics. They argue that the second law dictates that all unguided processes must run downhill toward disorder, towards entropy. Therefore, the emergence of complex specified information, or CSI, cannot be generated spontaneously by natural causes. It requires an external input of intelligence.
That's an interesting point, though I think I'd frame it differently. The burden is really on naturalistic mechanisms to explain how complex information, and I mean not just order, but specific, coded information like we see in DNA, spontaneously increases in a universe apparently governed by entropy. We know that physical processes can create ordered structures, sure, like crystals, but these tend to be repetitive and relatively simple. Life requires contingent information, information that specifies function. If you acknowledge the second law implies degradation, then relying solely on chance to generate these non-repeating, functional blueprints for life requires, at the very least, an extraordinary explanatory leap.
That extraordinary leap is, I believe, solved by a fairly simple distinction. The second law applies strictly to isolated systems. The Earth, and indeed all living organisms, are what we call open, dissipative systems. They're sustained by continuous energy flows, chiefly from the sun. Now, in these open systems, local decreases in entropy, like a plant growing or a species evolving greater complexity, are globally compensated by a far greater increase in entropy out in the environment. So the law holds overall, but it absolutely permits the local emergence of complexity. And this mechanism permits self-organization. Think of dynamic phenomena like Baynard convection cells in heated liquid, or even the large-scale organization you see in ant colonies. These systems spontaneously generate complex, adaptive spatial and temporal patterns just from unintelligent components interacting with energy flows. This demonstrates, I think, quite powerfully that complexity doesn't inherently require a designer. It can emerge naturally from interacting mechanisms and energy flows, often creating just the mere appearance of intelligence.
I acknowledge that self-organization generates complex patterns, certainly, but I question whether it truly explains the specification we see in biological systems. Convection cells are beautiful, yes, they're ordered patterns, but they are highly constrained and pretty predictable by simple physical laws. DNA, on the other hand, is contingent. It carries non-repeating, essentially arbitrary information, like a written language. If you apply heat to water, you always get the same kind of cells. But if you start the process of life, you don't necessarily get the same outcome every time, which suggests the involvement of a source of contingency that is perhaps more than just raw energy flow.
But I think you're defining specified complexity there in a way that is almost scientifically useless, defining it as basically a gap that only a designer can fill. If complexity and organization emerge from simple rules and energy flows, as demonstrated time and again in self-organizing systems, then we do have a naturalistic mechanism that avoids the need for some magical insertion of information. The burden, I maintain, remains squarely on ID theorists to show how their intelligent cause operates, rather than just repeatedly asserting that natural mechanisms are insufficient.
All right, let's turn our attention now perhaps to the cosmic scale, where the argument from design is arguably strongest and maybe most difficult to counter. Contemporary physics has identified what are called the anthropic coincidences. These are cosmological variables, or anthropic numbers, that seem to be incredibly finely adjusted to allow for life as we know it. Changing the strength of gravity, or the weak nuclear force, or the ratio of matter to energy by even tiny, tiny increments results in a universe completely incapable of forming stars, or carbon, or any kind of complexity. The extreme improbability of these constants randomly falling into the life-permitting zone strongly suggests to many a necessity for design or some kind of selection.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the improbability itself necessitates a designer. Seeing these coincidences purely as evidence of design is to me an exercise in the weak anthropic principle, which basically says if the constants were different, well, we wouldn't be here having this conversation to observe them. It's a bit like being surprised that the lottery winner happens to have the right ticket. Of course they do, or they wouldn't have won the lottery. It's a post hoc observation. Furthermore, invoking a supernatural designer to explain this fine-tuning is really an appeal to an object, a mind, or an entity that lacks any independent evidential warrant, and for which we have absolutely no mechanistic understanding. The age-old problem of design regress remains. Why is the designer itself not subject to the same question of improbable design? Who designed the designer? It offers an explanation that essentially terminates rational inquiry without providing any physical or observable mechanism.
But what is the credible naturalistic alternative, then, to avoid that intellectual regress? Your objection about the designer's origin is a fair philosophical point, but the sheer statistical improbability of these coincidences does seem to require an explanation beyond, well, we just got lucky. If you dismiss the designer for lacking independent warrant, you really must offer an alternative that is, at the very least, intellectually coherent and ideally avoids introducing something equally unevidenced.
Well, the prevailing naturalistic alternative, the one seriously discussed in physics, is the multiverse theory. This posits that our universe is simply one bubble, perhaps, in an enormous ensemble of possibilities, each with different physical constants. We naturally reside in the one that is, by sheer necessity, conducive to the emergence of complexity in consciousness. Now, this explanation manages to appeal to the kinds of objects, physical causes, differing physical laws for which there is at least independent theoretical warrant in physics, stemming from theories like cosmic inflation or string theory.
I find that preference highly suspicious, if I'm honest. You dismiss the designer as an appeal to an object lacking independent warrant. Yet you seem perfectly comfortable embracing the multiverse, which is, let's face it, at present also entirely outside the realm of direct empirical observation. It requires positing an infinite or near-infinite number of untestable, unobservable universes, merely to explain away a single perceived improbability in our own. It seems like the very definition of inventing an entity, an infinite number of them no less, simply to sustain philosophical naturalism at all costs.
The key difference, I would argue, is the methodological consistency. The multiverse, while certainly speculative, is rooted in the extension of existing physical laws and theories. Its predictions, even if not directly observable yet, are at least theoretically linked to potentially observable cosmic phenomena, like patterns in the cosmic microwave background. It maintains methodological rigor. The designer hypothesis, however, introduces a cause that fundamentally divorces itself from testable, systematic investigation. Science simply cannot build a research program around "God did it," whereas physics can and does build testable models around the concept of cosmological ensembles, even if testing is incredibly difficult. That, for me, is the crucial distinction between a hypothesis that is speculative but scientifically admissible and one that is fundamentally opaque to science.
So this discussion today, I think, reveals that ID forces science to confront its boundaries, and sometimes its often unstated reliance on philosophical, naturalistic assumptions. The sheer complexity observed in biological machinery and the remarkable fine-tuning of the universe do pose legitimate questions regarding the explanatory sufficiency of purely unintelligent chance mechanisms. These observations perhaps leave open the possibility that an intelligent cause shaped the world, and ID argues that detecting such intelligence should be considered a valid, objective scientific conclusion, irrespective of whether the designer is ultimately natural or supernatural.
Conversely, I'd argue the growing body of evidence shows that when subjected to rigorous methodological naturalism, ID arguments consistently fail the burden of proof. Whether it's through exaptation, dismantling the irreducible complexity concept, or our robust understanding of open systems overriding thermodynamic objections, natural explanations are proving increasingly sufficient, and given the well-documented political and ideological wedge purpose behind the movement, the persistent resistance to providing any kind of scientific mechanism for the designer strongly suggests that ID is not primarily a scientific pursuit, but rather an attempt to use the language of science to validate a essentially theological worldview.
And yet, the fundamental questions remain profound, don't they? The nature of life, of information, and the origin of our apparently finely tuned cosmos. These touch on an incredibly deep disagreements about the ultimate nature of the world itself.
Precisely. And perhaps the value of this kind of intellectual exchange is that it forces both sides to really scrutinize their evidence, to question their assumptions, and to define their methodology rigorously. This reliance on evidence and reasoning, wherever it leads, must continue to guide our understanding as we explore the origins of complexity in all domains.